Well, good afternoon, Dave. Why don't we begin by you telling us a bit about your professional background and about Denver RTD?
Well, thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be with you. And regarding myself, I've been in the general manager and CEO role for about 3 years now at RTD. And I've been with RTD overall about 25 years. So I've had a variety of different positions throughout that history, largely in the background of safety. I acted as primarily the chief safety officer for all those years previous to my current role, and a lot of work with security as well, and also asset management and state of good repair. And so before I was with RTD, I did a variety of different things. I have a bachelor's degree in geology, and I have an MBA. And so originally right out of college, I worked in the oil and gas industry, and then I worked in the environmental industry for a few years, which kind of gave me that next transition to RTD, where I started as the safety and environmental manager, and here I am 25 years later. And as you may know, RTD, we're a multimodal organization. We are the public transit operator for the 8-county metropolitan region of Denver. And we operate fixed bus routes, we operate light rail, we operate commuter rail, and we operate paratransit services to include Access-a-Ride, and then also Call-and-Ride, which is similar to a microtransit.
Now, what is your operating budget?
Our operating budget, Doug, is just over $600 million right now. We have about 2,900 employees, and then we also have about another 1,700 contracted employees that also help provide the family of services that we do serving our community here in the Denver area.
So you really do loom large in the Denver region. You're one of the biggest.
Well, we're a big agency, and I think that's one maybe misperception about Denver, especially for people that live here. I don't think that people here in the Denver area really consider Denver to be a transit city, but as you look at the build-out we've done over the last half a dozen years or so, we really are up there. We provide about 330,000 daily passenger trips and just over 100 million trips on an annual basis.
So you'd call the Denver region transit-friendly?
I do.
Measure, I would think.
I do, and out of some of those projects that we just recently opened is we opened our University of Colorado A-Line, which is commuter rail service between Denver Union Station and Denver International Airport. And that has really just, I think, from a transit and transportation perspective, really opened up Denver because we have a great airport, but one of the complaints is that it's so far out from the center city. Well, now with the University of Colorado A-Line, you can get into the center city. The trip from DIA to Union Station is about 37 minutes, and it's about $9. So, we've really opened up, I think, accessibility in that for the traveler and the business person.
Well, I'm thinking about my last cab ride from the airport to downtown Denver, and you're offering a real bargain.
Yeah, I know that as we look around the country, everyone has kind of a different fee structure, but we get pretty positive feedback on the overall service. Our frequency is about every 15 minutes, and we also serve a lot of the employees out at Denver International Airport that use it for a commuting service. So it's been really popular, and it's one of the great services we've been able to roll out in the last couple of years as we started commuter rail. And then, of course, the whole renovation of Denver Union Station, where all of our modes come into Union Station now. We have light rail, commuter rail, fixed route bus network comes into Union Station, and then also Amtrak serves it with 2 trains a day.
Whoa. Well, let's turn to our topic today, our main topic, the past program study that you've launched, and actually I think you've got your report, if I understand, and you're following through on it. Tell us why you launched the past program study, and how did you structure it?
Doug, thank you for that question on the past program working group. But let me start with just a little bit of history. Back in 2014 and then into 2015, we started on looking at our fare across the entire organization, not just of its rates, but we looked at the structure. And we had a few goals in mind when we did that. One of them was we really wanted to simplify our fare structure because we had several different classes as far as we had airport service on buses, we had regional routes, we had express routes, and we had local routes. And then to make it more complicated, on light rail, we had fare zones. So the fare was determined on how many zones you went through, whether it was a local trip or an express or a regional trip. So fairly complicated fare structure. One of our objectives was to try to simplify that. So we embarked out on this fare study that took about a year and a half to get through. It was a huge undertaking and process. At the end of the day, we brought forward a recommendation to our board of directors in about a third of the way through 2015. And the board, adopted the recommendation that we did. One of the things we looked at was trying to look at a flat fare on rail services in general, but people that rode the bus network said, hey, the flat fare on bus doesn't seem so, the flat fare on rail doesn't seem so equitable to us because, people are taking longer trips maybe on rail and we're paying more on the bus side. So we ended up not going with the flat fare, but we were able to reduce one of the fare categories. So instead of having multiple ones, we ended up with just 3 types of service now. We have airport, regional, and local. And so we were able to at least eliminate one of those categories. We still have fare zones. But what really sprung up the PASS program working group was that we have a couple of PASS media programs that we have that have been very challenging to price. They're very popular. One is called EcoPass. That's what we call it. And then we have a few other programs. But to bring it short, though, the board in their adoption of what they did in 2015 is they said, we would like you to look at all of our PASS programs. So we're good on the rates, we're good on the structure, but we want you to look at all the PASS programs and determine whether, those are the right PASS programs, are they priced right, are there things we'd want to tweak with them or adjust? And so it was really a board direction that said, we want you to engage a working group and look at these things. So fast forward a number of months, and what we came up with was the PASS program working group. And we also had some fairly clear direction from the board on it having to be, the makeup of the group having to be very broad-based in terms of geography because we operate in 8 different counties over 2,400 square miles. So that was one piece we had to address. And then they wanted it very diverse in terms of the types of people that we would have serving on the committee, meaning what they would represent, like people that were representing the current EcoPass program holders, whether they might be a government body or whether they might be a private employer. They wanted us to make sure that we had input and access from people that were concerned about the affordability of fares. So, and they wanted universities represented because that was another program we were looking at. So we embarked on how do we build this very diverse community of stakeholders. What we ended up doing is we brought in a facilitator. We developed a process for that facilitator to reach out to a bunch of different candidates that we had identified for the facilitator. And we drove this process quite a bit with guidelines that the board had adopted, of course. And then we had the board initially, before we even started, agree to the guidelines and the goals and objectives of what we were going to do with the PASS program working group. So over the course of a few information items over a few months, and then finally with an action to our board, we had the board adopt some guiding principles and objectives that then we could guide this process with. So that was very critical to have that clear direction from our governing body on what they wanted us to do, and then the guiding principles or the framework in how this work would be done. So then we went about working with our facilitator and selecting the PASS program working group members, and I want to say we ended up with about 26 or so different people representing a wide geographic base, a wide base of different kinds of stakeholders that had a lot of different, I would call them priorities or things that they wanted to make sure that we looked at. One of the things that I challenged the group with, and this process took, by the way, a little over a year. So when we invited people to participate, we said this is going to be a lot of hard work. It's going to be at least one half-day meeting per month. There's going to be a lot of homework. And at the end of the day, what we're really looking for you to do is to work within these guidelines and principles, but we're going to want a recommendation or recommendations that the past program working group provides to our general manager and CEO and the senior leadership team that are primarily meet two very high-level pieces. One is it has to be fiscally sustainable. You can't give us a recommendation that we cannot implement. So it has to be fiscally sustainable across our entire region. What works in one area has to work throughout. And then number two, it has to be generally a consensus-based recommendation from the working group. And the reason that I took that approach on the consensus-based is I didn't want to have winners and losers and having, majority vote and then people feeling, well, the people that I advocate for, the programs that I advocate for did well, and then having people feel like, oh, we did all this work and the groups that I advocate for are not really addressed. So those were kind of the high-level driving objectives and principles. I did get questions from the group from time to time about, well, how can we be guaranteed that you're going to take all our work and put it into place? And I would always bring them back to those two primary things that I gave them, fiscal sustainability, and you have to be consensus-based because we don't want to have winners and losers. And also what I'm thinking about throughout this process as well is that as stakeholders go through a similar process that staff would go through otherwise, then they have to kind of wrestle and challenge with all the things that we wrestle with in terms of getting to a decision point about how we're going to move forward so that they understand all the competing priorities that we have and all the challenges that we have. And so that type of an education and informing process is really invaluable to stakeholders because then at the end of the day, they've walked in our shoes and they're like, wow, we get this. You have a lot of challenges, a lot of competing priorities, and we see why you can't do everything that everybody asks.
Now, how were you as CEO involved in this process?
I had
with the close to it.
Well, I would get very concise and timely briefings from the RTD team that participated. And our participation, I should have mentioned earlier, of about those 26 or so individuals that made up the working group, and then we had the facilitator, and then we hired a consultant, by the way. So that consultant could do all the modeling and crunch all the numbers and look at all the different models and answer questions in regards to that, like if we change this, what does it do over here? Or, if we increase fare, what does it do to ridership? Or if we put this component in, what does it do over here? So we had good support through the facilitator and a consultant that was an expert in this field. And then we had two members of the RTD staff team that participated on the working group. One was our manager of equity and civil rights kind of thing. And the other person was our chief financial officer because we wanted to make sure that the group's conversation was staying intact around fiscal sustainability. And then, of course, we were very concerned about equity throughout the entire conversation. So that's why we had our manager of Title VI and equity in there.
Now, did you encounter any particular challenges as you went through this, I think you said year-long process? Any rocky points or challenges pop up?
We certainly had our moments, Doug. I'm glad you asked that because I think the first meeting, maybe even the second meeting. So I was at, I think, the second meeting and addressed the past program working group from my perspective, but I did not participate in the meetings that we had. And by the way, I'll tell you, we did have public participation at each of these meetings on the agenda. So we moved these meetings, these monthly meetings, we moved them throughout our geographical 8-county area.
Great.
Because part of the model we wanted to have was not just to hear from the stakeholders on the group, but we wanted to hear from the public. And so we had that element out there. And so I didn't participate meeting to meeting. My staff team and the facilitator would come back and brief me whenever they felt it was appropriate or when they were making progress. But I would say, I don't know if it was after the first meeting. It may have been after the second meeting where, it almost imploded. There were people that were just like already frustrated, and I can't even recall the dynamics. All I know is that there were people calling up our facilitator and saying, I'm quitting, I'm bowing out. But our facilitator said, no, and the reasons they would state, and they would say, this is exactly why we need you on the working group, is we need your perspective. We know that you may not agree here or see eye to eye there, and there's going to be some dialogue that's going to be challenging, but I would say we had a number of moments in the process where we almost lost key people. And, I credit the facilitator, I credit our 2-member staff team, and I credit our consultant for being able to kind of keep things moving and rolling. And then at the same time, Doug, it's important, we did give periodic updates to our board of directors. So every couple of months we would go update the board, because the people that were on these stakeholder groups, some of them are very influential and are very good about getting their messages out. So we wanted to make sure that we were keeping our board informed so that there weren't going to be any surprises in what other people were messaging. And that got a little bit challenging because sometimes there were some groups that might message something a little bit different than what our board had talked about on some of the parameters.
Did you ever have to intervene, Dave, or
did I ever have to intervene?
Stay out?
I never had to intervene. Now, I did provide guidance to the facilitator and to my 2 team members based on what they were briefing me on as far as what they were hearing at the meetings and things like that. So I would say that my role was really to provide guidance and leadership to our team members, our consultant, and our facilitator through the process. Like they would come back to me with a problem, well, like, what do you think we should do in light of this? And I would give them, well, we need to inform them on, this particular topic or provide more education. Or they would come in and say, here's what we're thinking of going with this type of information. Do you think that's appropriate? And I would say, yes, I would either kind of affirm or provide direction otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So you stayed close in terms of overall direction and quality control kinds of things.
I did, Doug, because I'll admit, I was a little concerned about this format of a highly stakeholder-driven process, right? You're giving up.
Well, you might have been concerned.
You're giving up a certain element of control, even though you have all these guiding principles, and they have their instructions very well about what our expectation is about the recommendations from the working group at the end of the day. It's a little hard sometimes to give up the reins. But I think what was fruitful is because they were part of the process and they learned and were educated, and it's almost like, hey, now we know what you go through, RTD staff and board of directors, when you're having to make a decision on something. We get it and we understand it, so there was a lot more buy-in. Now, if I might, let's fast forward to where we are today. So we received the recommendations from the past program working group in late February. And, I will share with you that, we did receive some feedback from our governing body that, they wanted to have some variety along those recommendations. They just didn't want to have one thing that was a take it or leave it. And that was a little bit challenging because the whole nature of putting together, looking holistically at your fair and your programs is really, you can't really look item by item. You have to look at things in a holistic universe. So when we got the recommendation, there were some elements in there that, maybe caused some concern. We're now just getting ready to start to take this information out to the public. We're really starting the big public input process through a series of public meetings and web tools and surveys. And we're really going to look at all these different elements that were recommended and get public input on what they think about all the different elements. And then, after that process, then we'll go back to the board with some recommendations and some alternatives. But actually, before we channel it right into a formal recommendation for our board, we'll go back and report out, here's what we heard from the public. And so we'll give them a good report and a readout on what the public's saying, and then we'll give the board time to digest that. Then we'll probably follow that up in a month, coming back with a recommendation.
And so when do you anticipate the board will be acting?
We anticipate the board will be acting probably in about a September timeframe.
Okay. This year,
and,
September.
Yes, this year. And it's important because we have a couple other dynamics going on right now. Is that at RTD we have a board-adopted policy that they look at the fare rates every 3 years. So we don't adjust our fare every year. Our policy says we'll look at it every 3 years, and we typically do assume that we're going to have some kind of an increase to stay up with CPI and inflation. But it's really up to the board to review the information we present to them and determine whether they want to make any changes to fares every 3 years. So we're right in that cycle as well. So what's timely about everything is the work that the past program working group is doing is feeding into the same cycle of the board considering whether we're going to make any fare changes for 2019. So whatever the board would adopt or approve in regards to either fare or whatever they might adopt or approve in regards to the past program working group would probably go into place, into effect sometime in 2019. And it will probably take us some time. So let's say the board does approve some of the recommendations. We're going to have to make some changes to our fare technology and our media and things like that. So there are some implementation challenges, that we'll have that we can't just flip a switch on. So, we're hopeful to get approval this fall and then start implementing things sometime in 19.
This is obviously has been a very public process. What about the media? The media been supportive? You've gotten good press and good coverage as you've gone through this year?
Well, the public was very interested in this process. We tried to be as transparent as we possibly could, so we actually stood up all of the information that's going through the past program working group on our website. So there was a link where the public could get to all the materials that were presented to the past program working group, all the presentations, all the things that they discussed, the meetings, the agendas, and all of that was all available through the website. There was a lot of media interest in what we were considering and what we were looking at throughout the program. So there was a great deal of interest.
Did you have any media representatives in the working group meeting?
No, there were no media that were part of the formal working group, but all of the meetings were open meetings because they were public meetings, so media could attend. And they did attend a few of them, more so than others depending on the topic and, was in particularly, was the recommendation rolling out at that meeting or what was happening?
Well, sir, this has been fascinating. You'll be happy to know I have one final question, and then your day soon gets much better. Did anything surprise you in this process? It sounds like it was very carefully constructed, designed, orchestrated, but did anything catch you off guard or surprise you as you went through it?
I appreciate that, Doug. As with any process, there's always lessons learned. And so that's one thing I've talked to the team about and the staff about is, let's make sure that we do that around this process. What went well? What would we do differently? Mm-hmm. If we applied this process to other things, how might that look? And so we haven't really spent much time on that, but we will. I think that I will tell you one of the things that surprised me is that, that it actually did stay together all the way to the end, and that there was a series of recommendations that came out that they made work. I mean, the group worked hard. There were some compromises made structurally between a couple of the programs that said, hey, we're willing to have an increase in our program if it means we can do more for this particular group over here through another program.
So there was real consensus at the end.
Well, I don't know if I would label it as consensus or compromise. And meaning, Doug, that hey, we get this. If we've got to make some, we've got to make some changes. We may not get it exactly our way, but if we're going to move this ahead, we need to consider these things. And I would say now I can't speak to the end result because the board has the final say in what we're going to do. But I think we have some good changes, some good structural changes that I think are going to help the agency. We kept it, fiscally sustainable. And in some ways, some people might look at it as innovative.
Well, it sounds very innovative and somewhat daring. So bottom line, there was compromise and I take it, no minority report of any kind. Everyone basically bought in.
That's correct, yeah.
And that's quite an accomplishment. Well, yeah. Sir, I really appreciate your time. I know how busy you are, And so thanks so much for taking 45 or so minutes telling us about the past program study. And I wish you well as you go through the implementation process. It sounds like it's going to yield a powerful return for RTD.
Well,
So thanks again.